Hi there and welcome back to my channel. For anybody that's not seen the first video, my name's Zoe and this channel is Words on Wealth. And today I'm going to dive straight into one of the big topics, which is inflation. It's been all over the headlines for months, maybe even years, we could say, and it's a really big topic. But crucially, I'm going to be breaking down what it is, why you need to know about it, and why it's kind of actually important to know about it as well. Not just something that they like to talk about in the headlines. So inflation, I really remember from when I did economics back at school, we used to have these little definition cards that we had to remember. And they said, and it is true, that inflation is just a general increase in prices. What this actually means is that prices increase, and you'll probably have seen this, depending on where you live in the world, over the last few years. Be it when you go to the shops and you see things like butter, olive oil, or other basic goods that you're buying creep up in price. Sometimes it's less of a creep and more of a jump. Crucially, what it means is that things are just getting more expensive. Inflation is normally measured by percentages. So what you'll often see in the headlines, which we saw last week in the UK, for example, is that inflation had increased by 3.5% in the month of April. Using a system called CPI, or at least that is what is used in the UK. Most countries have a really similar system. It's basically a basket of goods, not literal, it's not sat anywhere, metaphorical if you like, whereby they're measuring the price of them month on month. This basket of goods tries to reflect what people are more or less spending their money on. And it's quite an interesting one to have a look at because it does generally follow some trends. So, for example, the perm went out of the basket when we stopped perming our hair, and straighteners came in when we started doing that. There's been some funny ones recently as well to do with spending around, like I saw, for example, fish in a bag. Anybody that's a 90s kid might remember them. And that had dropped out, as had Angel Delight, whilst other healthier options, things like quinoa that have perhaps come more into the norm, had come into the basket. Of course, it's not for everybody, but it's supposed to be a reflection more or less as to what people are spending on at the time in the economy. And then it gets measured and the increase is seen. Now, crucially, governments do want some level of inflation. Normally, they're targeting around the 2% mark because often some level of inflation is seen as a healthy indicator. Basically, the economy is doing all right and prices are generally increasing at a rate that is manageable and not too silly. So they want to target that sort of 2% mark. Now, there's a few things recently that have sent inflation spiralling. In the UK, for example, we saw it go up to 10%. It was pretty much the same across Europe, the US, and other nations across the world have seen similar impacts. So what causes inflation to actually go up? There's a few main things. One of the first things that can cause it to happen is when the demand in an economy, so what people want to buy, actually just exceeds what they can produce. So in the same way that if you think, for example, you start to see something something's really in demand after the prices go up, it's exactly the same, just on a bigger scale with inflation. The second reason why this can happen is because there's actually a change in, for example, raw materials or supply chains. So let's say, for example, the price of oil, which is needed for not just driving cars with petrol, but also driving other parts of the supply chain, so things that are made in the economy. This will also generally affect inflation. People spending more money also just generally affects inflation. And sometimes, and there's a lot of human psychology behind all of this stuff, sometimes people just spend. They feel it, they feel happy, they feel generally more content with the state of the economy, and so they're spending more, and that is generally driving up prices. One of the other major reasons why prices can be driven up is because more money is pumped into the system. You might have thought to yourself before, why can't they just print more money? That would make everything better. Actually, printing more money and putting it into the economy can cause inflation because it's just like, if you think just pumping it in, and that can cause, I'm a very visual person, you'll come to see through this channel, what that can cause is higher levels of inflation. If there is also disruptions across this kind of thing, So there are some of the main reasons why inflation can be caused. If you were to really go into the nitty gritty, they can be split down into demand and supply side, but I don't really think we need to learn about that right now to know why inflation is important to know about and why it keeps cropping up in the headlines. So as I say, we've seen inflation spiral widely out of control up to the sort of 10% mark, when in reality governments are wanting it to be at about the 2% mark. So back to the headline from last week where we saw in the UK inflation hit 3.5%. You might be thinking now, well, that's probably a little bit above what they actually wanted it to be, and you'd be dead right. So what can governments do when inflation spirals out of control? There's a few things that they can do. One of the main things that they do is interest rates. So essentially what they do is they raise the interest rate, and this has two main effects. First and foremost, interest rates are normally placed on loans, so things like mortgages, business loans, and any other loans. This means that anybody with a loan, which is potentially quite a lot of people in an economy, will then see that their loan becomes more expensive. And as a result, they have less money left over to spend in the shops or wherever else, crucially in the economy, hopefully dampening some of those inflationary effects. The second thing that increasing interest rates does is that it means that leaving money in cash in the bank becomes a little bit more appealing, because interest rates are also placed usually on cash deposits. So if you know that you're going to get more for leaving your cash there, you're more likely to do it and you're less likely to want to spend it. Again, easing some of those pressures on people spending in the economy and hopefully the inflation that's there. So we saw inflation creep back up again in April. Why is this? Well, there's a few main reasons, and they normally tell you what the reasons are. Back to that CPI basket, they can see which parts of the basket, or indeed which products or services, have increased the most month on month. In the month of April, what it was owing to was mostly the likes of bills. So things like mobile phone bills, household bills, and other fun things like that. You might have seen it yourself, so again, it might not be a huge surprise necessarily, and it certainly wasn't necessarily a huge surprise to the economists that are working behind the scenes to predict inflation and to put some of those controls and measures in place. There had been a lot of caps in place on the likes of household bills, and this had meant that when they were removed in April, actually inflation was and did start to creep back up again. One of the main concerns, of course, is that it's pushing back up again beyond that 2% mark. And in the last few months prior to April, the UK and indeed other nations across Europe had started to see inflation come back down from those sort of 10% highs that it had scarily hit. So what does this mean then, and why is it all important for you? Because you've got a bit of background there as to what inflation is, how it's caused and how they can control it, but why do we even care? Well, first and foremost, what it basically does is confirm that any changes that you are seeing in the likes of prices are actually real. So it's useful to know for that, for a sort of sound mind check, to be like, yeah, I saw that, and it is true. It's not just me thinking that I'm spiraling or being neggy, but actually no, the bills had got more expensive. This is useful to know because then you can start to look at the trajectory of, for example, budgeting and other planning things that you're doing with your overall finances. Secondly, it's really good to know because of those controls. So I mentioned interest rates being one of the key ones that governments and central banks use to control inflation. With interest rates, they have been increasing them steadily to control the inflation that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. And interest rates had hit quite a high. They've started to come back down as inflation too has come back down. With inflation coming back up, it might mean that there's a bit of a pause, a bit of a breather on these drops that we're seeing in interest rates. So this could mean that the likes of, for example, mortgages and also the likes of cash reserves could become a little bit changeable. If, for example, you're looking to get a mortgage, it may well be that those interest rates on the mortgage aren't coming down as quickly as you were hoping. Equally, if you're somebody that's got, for example, cash in the bank, it could well be that the interest rates remain a little bit steadier for a bit longer. Of course, none of us can predict the future. And as with all these videos, it's worth me saying that this is all for educational purposes. It's not advice and should not be taken as such. You should always make sure that you're doing your own research. But indeed, it helps to point you in the direction of why you need to know about it, what it means, and what you should do on the back of that information. Hopefully this has been a quick whistle-stop tour of inflation and crucially that big headline from last week, and indeed any other headlines that we might well see coming up, as inevitably it's not going to be something that drops out the news in the next few weeks, months, or even years, I suspect. So hold tight as we see more changes. And if you've liked this video, please do give me a little like, maybe a comment, and anything else that we can do here on YouTube. Give me a follow on Instagram, and I'll see you soon for the next one. Bye for now.